Well, hello everybody. I'm Purple Trader 3169, and this is my dad, Dan
Hello.
Pinkston.
Hello.
I convinced him to watch this podcast, and by watching it, he has to participate.
Oh, yeah, I have no choice. It's dragooned.
I'm going to double check our sound here. It sounds like it works.
Okay.
On today's episode isn't that interesting? We are talking about history because my dad is a history buff and the myth or truth of history. So, we're going to start off. What is a myth? Does everybody know what a myth is? A myth is usually a traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. So,
Where did you get that definition?
I got that definition from Britannica.
Okay.
I just want to make sure everyone is aware. I am going to be called out so much on this podcast. B, it might end in tears.
That's right. And hers too.
Yeah.
Maybe laughter or dismay. We're not sure.
Yeah. So, for most of the beginning of time, most history was recorded through oral traditions, like storytelling, songs, poetry, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, it wasn't until 3500 BCE that writing was really, it wasn't invented until 3500 BCE. And that was in Mesopotamia and the Sumerians. Kind of interesting to me was that around the same time, independently, in the Indus Valley, they were inventing writing as well. China independently invented writing as well, but that wasn't until 500 BCE. Like 2,500 years later. So, but when they started writing, it wasn't for anything like for history. It was for trade, so that they could communicate across, long distances and make contracts and, for money and things like that. So they weren't actually they weren't writing down why they were, their history.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I recall, one of the first written documents that they've been able to decipher was one merchant writing to another one complaining about the quality of copper that they received when they were trading. So, yes, you're right.
Yeah. Did it say 1 star?
Yeah, right.
I'm putting it on my on your Yelp review.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, and then eventually it was religion and law. The father of history, so they say,
Mm-hmm.
is Herodotus.
Yes, that's correct.
Do you know much about Herodotus?
Well, I've read some of his history. He was Greek.
Yeah.
In the classical Greek period.
You read it?
Yes. It's good reading. It's pretty interesting. Some of the stories we have today are from his chronicles, including like the story of Midas and others that, of course, some of it may have been fairly contemporaneous, but a lot of it was probably just recording the stories that he'd heard before. But yes, he's probably the most famous historian.
Was it hard to understand?
It was Greek to me.
I set myself up for that one.
That's right. No, actually, it's actually very interesting reading. It's I mean, you can just sit down and read it. It's not for a specialist or anything like that.
Oh, okay.
But yes.
So history, as we have kind of delved into here, are documents. Diaries, letters, drawings, memoirs created by those who participated in or witnessed the events of the past. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's important with the invention of writing, because we couldn't get those documents or, drawings or anything like that without people writing. There is a caveat here.
What's that?
People for, up until, probably about 200 years ago, if not, less than that, people weren't educated unless they were rich. So most people didn't know how to read or write.
Well, interesting point, and I must disagree with you on that point. Actually, there was, like in America of 200 years ago, there was a high proportion of people knew how to read and write. So it's not as
I must disagree with you.
Okay.
79% of nationwide, as of 2022, are illiterate.
How many?
79. I mean, not illiterate. Are literate.
Oh, okay.
Point proven.
Yeah, that's right.
No, 79%.
100% of podcast commentators are illiterate, apparently.
No, 79% are literate.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think the actual.
That's 21.
Depends on how you define literacy, because I'm sure actually it's much higher than that.
Right.
I mean, they may not be able to read and write well, but almost everyone knows how to read and write.
Right.
At least in this country.
Right.
So.
Well, maybe the people you run with.
Well, when I was at Harvard Law School, most of those people could read and write.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. But it's not. History is also, like you were saying with myth, when you think back to the cave drawings from 200,000 years ago,
mm-hmm.
I mean, they were recording some version of either past events or of, their philosophy or just observations of nature, but they were leaving something that we can try to decipher.
Right.
We don't know exactly what they were having to say, but there has been like with the storytelling and so forth, that's a constant that people want to have an idea of where they came from and what happened before them.
Right.
And we still do.
Right. Well, so what is the difference between history and myth? Okay, why do we have myth, or why does history turn into myth?
Well, sometimes it's hit or myth.
Hello, Mappy. So they have a thing called euhemerism. Is that how you pronounce it?
Euhemerism?
Yeah.
I thought that was something you took preparation H for. Euhemerism?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is historical accounts become myths as they are exaggerated in the retelling, elaborations, and alterations that reflect cultural mores. Mores. So, what it's trying to say there is mostly, like, especially with oral traditions, when you're saying a story over and over again to make it more exciting or whatever, you're elaborating on it, or you're making it more exciting by adding a little detail here, or making something a little bit better. And so eventually it turns into George Washington had wooden teeth.
Right.
Or, he chopped down a cherry tree. Or, these things turn into, not necessarily fabrications, but they weren't true.
Well, I mean, they're true on some level, maybe not literally true, but they're true in the sense of what is important to human beings.
Right.
And the myth is, there's a famous author named Joseph Campbell who has charted out some of the standard myths and themes that people have had through all different kinds of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Like the myth of the theme of the hero.
Right.
The hero who comes from humble origins. He has to face some kind of obstacle and overcome it, and suffer problems and difficulties, and ultimately triumphs.
Yeah.
And that's a common theme in
Yeah.
Western, not just Western culture, but all kinds of cultures, because I think it reflects a human need for storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And to make sense of the world. Because what's difficult for people to think about is an idea that the world is simply random and nothing means anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that may very well be what the world is really like.
Right.
But it's part of our brain is to try to impose order on events and on the way people react to things, and they do it oftentimes through stories.
Right.
So that's the origin, of the myth. Basically, people want to understand something about the world.
Right.
And of course, at the beginning of human history, there were many things that they didn't have a scientific explanation for, so they needed to create an explanation, like the myths of the creation of the world,
Right.
and where people came from, and what the external signs about them mean, like what does thunder mean, what does lightning mean, why is it there, try to explain why it is that people are here but they suffer.
Right.
Why did they suffer? Is it because of something they've done wrong? Is it because they're being punished by some god? Is it chance?
Mm-hmm.
Is it something inherent in human nature that makes it difficult for people to that makes them be unkind to each other? Why are there wars? All these things. And people are they've been trying to put it into some kind of comprehensible order, and that's what why there are myths, why there is storytelling, and we still have it. We still have storytelling today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a way of imposing order on a disorderly universe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not just. I mean, look at, for example, it's not just pre-literate peoples. I mean, look at the way people look at American history, for example, and you were mentioning with George Washington and so on. We have a creation myth that our country, what was the reason why, for example, go back even further. Why was it okay for Europeans to invade this continent and take over from the Indians?
Right.
And so, we had to, at that time, back then, the idea was, well, we're civilizing the Indians, that, we as Europeans can use this land in a way that will be productive, where from their way of thinking at the time, Indians weren't doing that, or Native Americans. They were hunting, and they were subsisting, pretty well.
Right.
But we had to find a way to justify taking over the whole country, and part of it was people were thinking that there was some Christian ideal, Christian reason, to Christianize people who needed to be enlightened.
Right.
But in reality, it was the natural human impulse to keep moving and to take over, to take what you can take,
Yeah.
to make your own life better and the life of your children better. And so, but sometimes, even though that is the natural human way of being, sometimes it needs to be dressed up, or at least people feel it needs to be dressed up in a way to make it more morally acceptable.
Yeah.
And to give a reason for it. So our creation myth in this country is that we needed to throw out the British, and it was because we wanted freedom, and we wanted religious freedom, and we wanted all these things. But of course, it's only now, the reckoning of what does it mean to have a country based on freedom when it was based in large part on slavery.
Right.
I mean, huge amounts. And what does it mean that it's based on freedom, but the economics have been such that people who are have-nots, they might officially have freedom, but they don't necessarily have real freedom.
Right.
And so, we've come to this idea, a picture that everything in our past was perfect, and that it was all justified. But it's not a simple topic, because there were horrible things that were going on at the time, and the way the white people treated the black people especially, but also Indians and also others, it cannot be justified.
Right.
And at the time, it seemed that was just what everybody thought. And now we look back and realize that that was not the way it should be, or should have been.
Right.
But it was, and people don't really have a good idea of how racist things were back up. I mean, they still are to some extent, but particularly before the 1940s. And it is shocking when you read much history to see what people were really saying at the time, and you can't hardly even believe it. But one good thing is that things are getting better.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question whether or not people are just inherently biased or biased or prejudiced against people who do not look like their group.
Right.
Is that a relation? Is that a relic of tribalism that people have?
Right.
That's an interesting question. I mean, can you really get past those things? We can, certainly in a legal way, which we have done more or less.
Right.
But can you really get there on a humanistic basis?
Yeah.
Or is
with everybody?
Yeah. Or does it just come down to, well, you have to recognize your inherent biases, and that you're gonna feel differently about people who don't look like you.
Right.
And I mean, if maybe that can be gotten over. I think there's less of it now, but it may just be an inherent human trait.
Right.
anyway. And a lot of what history is recorded has been recorded by people as a way of justifying what they or their forebears have done.
Yeah.
And that
I think that inherently makes history books biased.
Well, and you kind of have to look at it as, when you think about it, that everything that happens, there are huge numbers of things happening all at once, and no one can comprehend all of it.
Yeah.
So the historian, whether it's an official historian, writing a history, or if it's just the people's concept, chooses certain aspects of what has happened to emphasize or to record.
Right.
And then when that happens, that process of selection is inherently not comprehensive. I mean, it's inherently an act of choice.
Yeah.
To decide what was important.
Yeah, I mean, you can't just be, something is happening here. You can't say, and this is happening here at the same time. You can't do that. I mean, it's physically impossible to write words on the same page at the same time.
Right.
You can't say, in Germany, this was happening. Meanwhile, in China,
well, there are some historians who try to do that. I mean, you can't do it on a scale that could really represent reality of what happened, because it's impossible. It's too much.
Yeah.
And there are different types of history, and the kind of history people find important is changing to some degree.
Right.
So, in the before, it was a lot of it was the history of kings and queens and what happened politically.
Right.
And what was happening at the highest levels of society.
Mm-hmm.
And now that has been explored. I mean, it's still being, you still read books about that all the time. They're all, they're being published often. For example, I just listened to an audiobook of a biography of Abraham Lincoln by a guy named Michael Burlingame, which was, I listened to it on audio. It was over 50 hours.
Jeez.
But the point is, that was another more or less political explanation of what was going on during Abraham Lincoln's life. But there's more interest in not just what the prominent white rich people were doing.
Right.
There's now more of an interest in what women were doing, what minorities were doing, what poor people were doing. And it's not as much now just an explanation of events. There's much more of an emphasis, and this has been for probably the past 75 years, much more of an emphasis on studying the lives of everyday people.
Yeah.
And both in a narrative way, narrative history is telling a story. There's also a history of searching out statistical things.
Right.
And trying to explain from that what was going on, like people who might look at the history of what farms were producing at the time, and what percentage of people worked on farms, and how many worked in factories, and what kind of real income did they have, and what was the distribution of income and opportunities among people.
Right.
And that has been a real theme over the last maybe even century, and there has been an emphasis on trying to recover the history of people whose stories were not told before. I mean, that's why there's an emphasis on feminist history. That's why there's an emphasis on trying to tell the story of black people and how they lived, and how what they went through as slaves, and then how they were treated so terribly after the Civil War. For example, talking about revisionist history, the story we used to hear was the Civil War was to free the slaves, and that when the slaves were freed, then it was a great thing, which it was. But what people don't really think about, and people who have this kind of rosy idea of what American history was, they don't think about how after the Civil War, the former Confederates and the white people basically conspired to make laws that kept black people in basically the same position they were in as slaves.
Right.
And used violence against them, and used violence against people who were trying to help black people. And it was a terrible, terrible time in history.
I mean, and not to mention, they couldn't, they couldn't own property, right?
Well, they could own property, but when they were slaves, there were slave codes which said, you can't teach black people to read or write.
Right.
And that, it was until fairly recently, they wouldn't allow a black person to testify in court against a white person. They wouldn't allow black people to be on juries. There were
voting and
and obviously voting. And once they got the vote in the 1860s, then the powers that be in the South, and sometimes in the North, I guess, they got together and tried to figure out ways to prevent blacks from voting. And, for example, they had the poll tax, where you had to go, before you could vote, you had to go pay money as a tax to vote. And so they would set it high enough that, your average black person or poor person couldn't vote. Or they would have literacy tests, where they'd have some ridiculously elaborate test to prove that you should be able to vote. They'd ask you some obscure question, obviously designed that you couldn't answer, and to prevent you from voting. So the people who have this rosy view of what history was like, what it was like, are deluding themselves.
Right.
And sometimes they have that view because they are concerned about things changing, and they're afraid that the power of white people is eroding. And it's true. And part of it is because of differing views about politics. And part of it is simply because demographically, things are changing. So how you view history is in many ways a political act. For example, people who are, say, quote, patriotic, they don't want to hear criticisms about what had happened in this country before. Right. It's like they're passing laws that you can't teach in middle school, or anything that basically denigrates history, or would, I think one of these laws says that you can't teach anything that would make one group feel sorry or sad or responsible for the problems of another group, which is, it's, for anybody who knows anything about history, it's revisionism. It's not the way it was, and the political reason for doing that is, partly because they're concerned that some people are concerned that they're losing the power of the narrative of American history.
Yeah.
And it is changing. I mean, people are being more realistic.
Yeah.
But it can go the other way too. I mean, there were very good things about American history. There was an underlying idea that religion should not control, the political establishment and so forth. And you can't and should not ignore those things. They're
Right.
good things. We have basically fair elections. We have open. I can go out on the street and say the president is a scoundrel, and nobody's going to come and arrest me for that. I mean, that's many places you can't do that.
Yeah.
People who, it's this conundrum of when you're looking at freedom of speech. And I happen to be an absolutist when it comes to freedom of speech. I think there should be no constraints on freedom of speech.
Right.
But the problem is then you allow people who are against freedom of speech use the freedom of speech
Yeah.
to try and
It's
oppress
like
other people. It's,
Catch-22
that's
there.
the thing. That's the hard part. I mean, so.
Well, so going along with that revisionist type theme there, Napoleon said, "History is a fable agreed upon." So.
That's exactly right. It is. It becomes the sort of joint collective memory of people, even though it may not be accurate.
Right.
But there's a need for that so that people have some commonality in how they perceive their society and how they got there.
Yeah.
But, again, it's like what the import of that quote is that writing history is a selective process.
Yeah.
And it's not constant over time. If you go back and read histories from like the 1920s, and well, actually before that, where it was based on the theory of manifest destiny. It was the destiny of white people to move over and to move across the country and develop, the resources of the country and to focus on individual effort.
Yeah.
And it was the mission, or the right of those people to conquer the Native American people and to have a war with Mexico and all of these things that, and that narrative has changed a lot, as probably the academic world has gotten very, very liberal.
Well, I mean, that also is one of the things I have here is it's kind of like, it's kind of biased because history is biased because it's based on it's based on perspective. Who is the one interpreting it?
Mm-hmm.
Who captured it? Who was there, but then who's interpreting that? Who's and who's editing it?
Right.
So say you're writing a history book, but if you're writing it from the perspective of the Mexicans, it's going to be a lot different history book than it will be from, the colonizers or.
Oh, that's exactly right. And a lot of it's written for an audience's preconceived ideas about
right.
what happened or what's important or why it's important. I mean, think about a history of Israel by Israelis, Jews who came from Europe after World War II and basically had to take it from the British, versus a history written by the Palestinian people who were there and who were pushed out. Now, theoretically, for a good reason, so that the Jews had a homeland.
Right.
But from their perspective, here's another invader that's come and trashed us, no matter how much they've suffered, now we're suffering.
Right.
So it is I think what you were just saying is very, very much true.
Yeah. Well, and like kind of, and then you add layers onto that where, like you're saying, in 1910 it's saying XYZ,
Mm-hmm.
and then I come back, read that 100 years later, I'm like, well, they said this.
Yeah.
It's hard over, and then, over hundreds and thousands of years, you're reading, all these multiple layers of, it's hard to, unless you dig really deep,
Mm-hmm.
to get the real story of how everybody kind of puzzle pieced together,
Yeah. Well, and I think it's sad that so many people have no interest in history,
Yeah.
and what you always hear is, oh, I didn't like it in school because I didn't want to just memorize dates and things like that. Well, the problem is at early stages, if you don't have much context,
Yeah.
you need this basic kind of understanding of what happened generally.
Right.
And of course, the farther you go in studying history and the more you read about it, then the more these ideas of what does history really mean? It's not as simple as you think when you're in middle school.
Right.
I mean, and that's where the study of writing history is called historiography.
Mm-hmm.
And there are great philosophic movements, and they've changed over the years about how history should be written and
Like
what
ethics
history
and
means.
stuff?
Well, like to what extent should it be a chronicle? A chronicle is basically this happened, then this happened.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, or should it be interpretive?
Or like,
Should it be like this happened because X
Right.
happened and why, and then why was a result of that?
well, and the problem with that is if it's too interpretive, that lends itself to biases. And,
Yeah, no, that's true. That's exactly true because it's essentially all history beyond just a timeline is
Mhm.
interpretive.
Yeah.
It's selective.
Right.
And how it's selected is a result of the bias of the person who's doing the selecting.
Yeah.
And that can be either, you can try to supplant that bias, you can try to be more inclusive, to be more open-minded, or not.
Right.
But it's going to be inherently in there somewhere.
Right.
And there's a theory that probably most people used to have, not so much now, I don't think, that human beings are progressing over time, that things are getting better and better and better.
Mm-hmm.
And we particularly thought that, I think, after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And as things did get better for most people, race relations were improving, you had the growth of more of a middle class, people had good incomes, they had a way to make a good living.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the economy has changed, and with global warming and with all these wars and with Black Lives Matter and all these things that have happened, I think people are losing the idea that things will necessarily get better.
Well, as a tangent to that, as kind of like if we go down that road, is it because we're looking at it too microscopically? Is it because we're just okay? Well, the past 10 years really have sucked.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being like, well, compared to 400 years ago, we're way better off.
And that's true. Well, we are here.
Yeah.
There are people living in India and Africa and other places who are not much better off than they were then.
Oh, that's true.
And
that's true.
But it kind of goes back to a certain degree to this question of whether or not you think people are perfectible. whether there are inherent things in human nature that will mean we always have wars, we will always have poverty, we will always have people who want to take power and control other people, and who will want to oppress other people.
Yeah.
And or do you think, which is kind of a conservative way of thinking, conservatives tend to think that people are inherently bad. Leftists tend to think people are inherently good.
Right.
And that things are improving and can be improved.
Right.
And that's a constant tension among thinking people. What is the real basic human nature? I mean, or there's yet a third way, which is to think we're just animals, and that there is no necessarily inevitable progression or regression
It's just the way things are going.
Right. It's just they're a mixture of rationality and of emotion and of hatred of others, but also a desire to be altruistic. And so the way history is written tends to reflect what people think about those kinds of things, what each author tends to think about it.
Right.
And, there are trends in history writing, which, because people who write history, they want to put their views out there, which means some kind of receptive audience. Now,
well, the thing too about that is, one of the things I wrote or I put down here is, in this society especially, you are put in an algorithm, and number one, you're getting the people who aren't like you, who are reading thousands of history books all day long, every day. They're put in an algorithm and they're seeing 4 sentences about history, and that's it. And it's about the thing that they like.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Right,
They're not
right.
seeing anything else. And, but when you do tend to pick up a history book, it's, hey, I like Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to read about that. It's not like, hey, let me read a book about, the War of 1812, or I don't know. Something
whatever.
completely different would be something in Europe at that time. Right. Nobody's going to, because they want instant gratification, now people are just not doing it.
Yeah. That's where education should come in, because in education, you should be exposed to things which you may or may not end up agreeing with.
Right.
And it depends on how it's taught, but at least it exposes you to different viewpoints.
Right.
And whereas I think what you're saying, people tend to self-select things to read or to be interested in that confirm their biases that they already have.
Right.
Like you said with the algorithm. I mean, the algorithm looks at what you've done in the past and predicts what you like.
Yeah. It'll say, I see that you like Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
I see that you like this author.
Right.
So
yeah, and it may show, based on the kind of book I've read about, say, Abraham Lincoln, it may either send me recommendations for books that say how great he was,
right.
or that, and there are many books out there that say that he was a terrible president, that he should never have, that the Civil War was never about slavery, which it was,
right.
Or it was, from a Confederate viewpoint, or that are saying that we should be venerating the Confederate history.
Right.
And like you said, the way things are set up today, maybe they've always been this way, you only are fed things that do not challenge you. But we all, whether or not there's an algorithm, we all do that in in human life.
Right.
We seek out the things that we find comfortable, that we find understandable, that's in accord with our basic personality and basic nature.
Right.
That's humans do that. I mean, you can't be realistically, you can't be constantly seeking to challenge your own beliefs. It's hard to do. It's hard to do. It's uncomfortable.
Well, it's uncomfortable and it's tiring.
Well, that's exactly right. And plus, the fact that, your view may be correct on some level. I mean, it may not be that, if I seek out books or articles or whatever that say that, all of white civilization is corrupt and should be, the Western patriarchy needs to be taken down and, everything about it is wrong. I like to think that I have a more nuanced view of the world than that, but it can be uncomfortable.
Right.
And plus, when you hear things like that, which are not consistent with your basic view of the world, you instinctively push back against it.
Yeah.
And you're never going to get to a point where everybody agrees on anything, really.
Yeah.
I mean, of any significance.
Yeah.
So that's just, part of being a thinking person in the world. But one thing I would have to, I would make a pitch for, I mean, not that people care that much, but if you know history, if you know the basics of it, even the basics of it, it improves your enjoyment and understanding of the world by so much. I mean, if you don't, many things, I think to a lot of people, will just seem mystifying why certain things happen.
Yeah.
In society, or in, here's this war, or here's this, political movement, or whatever, or here's this economic theory. If you don't understand about those things generally, then you don't really get an idea of why things are happening, and you don't know how to really react to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the great tragedy of people not knowing their history.
Yeah.
Is that there are so many subtleties of what is happening in the world that you can't really judge well without knowing what came before.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the pitch for historical education.
Yeah.
And also reading about things, as you get older. I mean, and let's face it, our popular culture is such these days that it's 99% of it is fluff.
Yeah.
Of course, it probably always was. I mean, it's never been like, 60% of the people were sitting around reading history or philosophy.
Right.
They weren't. They had to make a living.
Yeah.
And we all want to be amused and entertained.
Yeah.
That's human nature.
It's so weird when I do these podcasts, and I really do the research and everything like that, and it's so weird because 90% of the material that's out there is regurgitated from one website to the next, word for word.
Yeah, exactly.
Word for word. And so you really do have to go onto those websites that are a lot, all of my shows, I actually download, essays and, to actually get real information, and because you can't tell if what they're saying is just, regurgitated from 15 years ago, just...
Well, yeah. Well, it's like you had a list here of things that are common misconceptions about history that weren't really true, that we all, like you say, they just get repeated over and over. Like, for example, it's not history, but the idea that you should wear a hat because you lose 90% of the heat through your head.
Yeah.
there's no scientific basis for that.
Yeah.
There never was. Some advertising person made it up. Or like, you should drink 8 glasses of water a day. There's no scientific evidence for that.
Yeah.
Or that you
The
get
10,000 steps thing, not real.
Yeah, somebody just made it up. I mean, it's good. It's good, but it's not.
Yeah.
But it's just. And the same thing with a lot of the historical things that we think of. I mean, you see the same things repeated over and over because it's easy. Because, at some point, it was on Wikipedia and somebody found it, and so everybody had just.
Yeah.
And many times, as I'm sure you found when you are doing your research, like you said, many times it's exactly the same words. It's not even, here's information that's been refiltered. It's like, this is the exact same words that people wrote probably 20 years ago, and then because it's easy to repeat.
Yeah, copy, paste.
Yeah.
Copy, paste.
That's right. Right, exactly.
I did want to talk about like when like alternative facts and how that affects history. So like fake news and it kind of all ties together. So like now we're not like us, but like we're making history as we speak, as we live. And if people are the vocal minority are, creating alternative news, how does that affect history in the future?
Well, I think one thing that's going on is that there is so much more raw material for history now.
Yeah.
I mean, not just with the internet, but even people being able to type.
Yeah.
People that the electronic storage of documents and creation of documents. It's huge. I mean, I work for the federal government, and when you realize the volume of records that are kept, the problem is, of course, that there are so many records. How do you discriminate between? Yeah, exactly. How do you study it? And there are historians who have incredibly obscure, areas of expertise. Like I had a case where one of the questions was, what happened in these industrial plants during World War II? And there are people who study administrative law from that time period, and these incredibly dry analysis of what happened and how it happened, because there is just so much. You can only pick a manageable amount. Now, there's still people who are what we would call narrative historians, like somebody, I have to think of the names, but people who write history that's kind of unfootnoted history, who are telling a story. Like David McCullough, perfect example. The one who wrote the biography of Harry Truman and the Johnstown flood and the Panama Canal and all these things. And that's a trend that people like to read about. It's and it's based on historical research, but it's big themes. It's not, and it's human and it's human scale too. I mean, it's about the people as opposed to the very arcane, very specific things that some people study.
Right.
But like you're saying, there's just so much, and of course now, I mean, think of photography, for example. I mean, it used to be, a lot of people took a lot of photographs, but you would take your photographs and you'd wait, and then you get your 12 pictures or your 24 pictures, and that was it. And you couldn't communicate it to anybody. Now, it's
like people would come over
billions and billions of pictures taken every day.
Yeah, like people would come over to your house to look at. You came back from a trip and be like, "Have dinner with me. Look at my photos."
Right, and now it's somebody who wants to show their photos that you're a pest.
Yeah.
You know, it's just there's just so much raw material because of the technology, and it makes it harder to even know where to start to winnow it out.
Yeah. Well, and how do you know what things go to what event and like, you know, because people don't print them out anymore,
Right.
and so like most of the photos would have like things written on the back of them
Right.
because it was manageable to do that.
Yeah.
Now, not so much.
Well, your average person now probably has 3,000 or 4,000 pictures on their phone.
Yeah.
You know, I think how many albums that would take. You
Yeah.
would need to have that. And how
Yeah.
often do you go back? I mean, sometimes you do. And it's a lot easier to sit and flip through your pictures than it was to go out and get the album and you know, and then all those corners you used to
Yeah.
lick to put the pictures in would get all dried up and the pictures would fall out and everything. But I think you touched on something, and that is just the sheer amount of raw material there is now. I mean, who are going to be the chroniclers of 50 years from now if we're even around?
Well, and I mean, are they saving all the social media feeds? Are they? I mean, because a lot of this stuff, like the vocal minority stuff, people are rising against something or doing something, making big deals out of. I mean, it could be something, could be nothing.
Yeah.
Making big deals, but that's not documented necessarily on paper.
Yeah. No, that's true. It's.
I mean, because if, say, for example, Twitter just went down, are those being saved?
Well, think of. I mean, another.
I think
point is,
I think I saw a. I don't know where I saw it. This was just in passing, and I just thought to. It said that for the first 10 years of Twitter, the government saved every single tweet, and now it only saves the important ones.
Yeah. Well, and that's
So-
you know that's just the way of the world, and you know we're so dependent on the technology that you know what. For example, think of all the things that are on floppy disks.
Yeah.
Nobody has a way to read it.
Yeah.
I mean, specialists do, but there are, you know, shelf after shelf after shelf of things like that, which.
There was a lady in the 70s who, like, obsessively recorded every show from, like, 1970.
Yeah, I think I've heard of
yeah.
her. Yeah.
And she's, like, the only reason why we have
Yeah,
a lot of those
right.
shows still.
Right.
Is because she recorded them.
Right. Yeah.
Some lady.
Things-
Like,
That's a concern. I mean, history. You know, in the old days, the problem was there weren't enough sources to back up what people were interpreting and how they came up with writing the history. Now, it's the opposite. There's
Yeah.
too much.
well, I mean, at the same time, we're, like, talking about this, right? And it's like, you know, we can't, you know, read that or, you know, we can't look that up or... But it's kind of like... That's like hoarder status. You know, why do we need all that stuff? Why...
Yeah.
You know, we've been doing fine with, like, a vase and, you know, a writing on a cave wall. Like, why, you know... I mean...
Well, I mean, it partly is because that's how we communicate these days. We communicate in writing, not so much I mean, we do on an everyday basis,
Yeah.
but basically for business,
Yeah.
or it's essentially all in writing because you want to keep something in case.
I think what's scary about it is that everything's on the computer.
Yeah, I mean, what happens when the electromagnetic pulse happens and wipes out all the memories,
Yeah.
or what happens when the technology changes and you can't read, like the floppy disk, you can't read it anymore, or on the reel-to-reel
Yeah.
computer tapes they used to have years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think the other thing is that we're so bombarded with information that it's harder to take a step back and try to make sense of it because it's just the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah. That's... I mean... I think that's really rough, too, because before it was like everyone was either I'm against this. I'm for this. You know, like, based on the one news show they saw at 6 p.m. You know,
Yeah.
or the
Everybody,
newspaper.
that's where I think everybody had shared experiences. They don't now. Things are all fragmented.
Yeah.
So, anything else that you wanted to raise?
The mic, I dropped it. Oh, history repeats itself. Did you know, by the way, I found this interesting. History repeats itself. First as a tragedy, second as a farce. That's the whole quote. Did you know that?
I had not heard that quote, but...
Yeah, that was by Karl Marx. And Mark Twain said, history never repeats itself, but it often does rhyme. That's what Mark Twain said.
Yeah, that makes sense, too.
Um...
History repeats itself in the sense that human events are based on human nature, and human nature never changes.
I said, we see the same events happening again because it's human nature.
That's right.
And I said, because it's human nature to find patterns and similarities in things.
Well, right, exactly.
I mean, it's not the same thing, but you want to not be the only person this happened to in all of time.
Right.
You know, this is, I mean...
The history in the end is an expression of the human need to impose order on things that at first glance don't seem to have any comprehensive form.
It says, I had one, the greater degree of myth we allow, the less able we become to handle change. History is the conceptual tool we have invented to allow us to make sense of changing conditions and to recognize the conditions that surround us at any time as the result of endless contingency.
Who said that?
Sean.
Britannica. So on that note, should we wind up?
Yeah.
Okay. That was interesting.
What did you find interesting?
Just sitting and talking, blathering, which is my usual way of imposing order on the universe. But thank you for inviting me to be on it. I enjoyed it. It was fun.
Yeah, it was I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yep.
Pretty fun. I don't normally do history stuff, but, yeah.
All right.
So, that's my paps. That's my dad. So, he is Dan Pinkston. I'm Purple Trader 3169. Like, follow, subscribe. Thanks.
Send money.
Yeah, I could do with some money. Lots of it.
Okay.
Okay, bye.